Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Doffney. I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library. It is my pleasure to present our speakers for today, Lawrence and Joni Jones. We've had them speak before on autism, but today they're going to be talking about a new emerging concept called Platonic parenting. Lawrence Jones recently retired in 2017 as a New Jersey Superior Court judge, and he served as the president of the New Jersey Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges and has authored over 60 opinions on novel issues of law. Joni is a registered nurse, board certified in psychiatric and mental health nursing, who retired from the New Jersey Board of Nursing, serving the public under two separate governors of Corzine and Christie. She also served on Governor Murphy's transition team on health-related issues. So welcome, both of you. Thanks for agreeing to talk to us today. We will be taking your questions at the end of the program, so please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature or the chat feature in the Zoom dashboard. There will be a survey that will be available as well after this, as well as in a follow-up email. If you have time, we ask you please complete the survey. We'd love to hear what you have to say about our programming, and we always love getting your feedback. So Larry and Joni have also provided me with some links to more information about Platonic parenting, and I will send them out in the chat so that you can visit them at your leisure. If for whatever reason you can't access them, don't worry. I will send a follow-up email that will include the links as well. Just a quick rundown before we jump into the content for today of the Zoom dashboard. This is what your dashboard should look like if you are using a PC or a Mac. If you're using a mobile device, the dashboard is going to look a little bit different, but all of the features will still be there. You can locate your audio settings in the bottom left corner to make sure that it matches up with the audio device that you're using. You can use the raise hand button in the middle here if you have any problems. I will then get in contact with you and hopefully be able to solve them. And as I mentioned before about questions, you can submit them hitting the chat button or the Q&A button. And at the end of the program, we'd be happy to answer them for you. So without any further ado, let's jump into the content. All right, the first question we have is, what is Platonic parenting? Joni, do you want to tell us about that, please?
Yeah, it's simply a concept where parents are not involved in a romantic relationship and they're not married to each other. So there can be a variety of possible arrangements in this, and it can be established between people who know each other or people who are just acquaintances and getting to know each other. And it can be two individuals, it can be even more than two individuals. But what I found very intriguing, Andrew, is when I was learning about this concept, for years as a mental health professional, I had led educational groups where I had spoken to individuals that were in dysfunctional relationships because they were simply confusing sexual compatibility with love. So when I saw this, I became very intrigued and wanted to learn a little bit more about it.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to the next one. This is also for Joni. Why might some people consider Platonic parenting?
Well, some people have had traumatic experiences as a child with their own parents' separations or their divorce. So they may want to have children, and then they're having a thought process that if they don't get married, they won't encounter similar experiences based on that marriage or that separation. Some people feel like they're aging out or they're getting older and they haven't just found that right person yet. And they still want to have, children, and they're thinking about their quote unquote biological clock. And there's other people that, are very mindful and they're very logical thinkers in their vision on how to raise a child. So they're looking for those qualities and that match based on parenting skills.
Larry, what are some of the misconceptions about Platonic parenting?
All right. Well, first of all, again, Andrew, thank you for having us here, for inviting us here. You know, platonic parenting is, as you stated originally, it's an emerging concept. It's an emerging concept. So it's for many people, they've never heard of it before. I think platonic parenting means, okay, peaceful parenting, or, you know, parents who get along with each other. Sometimes people who are divorced, they're platonically parenting because they are civil to each other. And of course, they're no longer in a romantic relationship, as Joni said. But the platonic parenting that's getting a lot of coverage in the media these days, in some of the links which were sent to New York Times and the Washington Post, really is a different type of relationship. It's a relationship really where there is no romantic involvement, no romantic history. And so when they interview a lot of people who state that they are interested in perhaps having a platonic parenting relationship with someone in the future, they tend to gravitate, in my readings, on the theory that, well, this is the way to avoid a messy divorce, or they've already had a very bad relationship, so this is the way to kind of insulate that from happening again, that somehow it's risk-free. Some people find it to be new and, you know, exciting in some fashion. Now, we're going to platonically parent together and, you know, raise a child together with someone who they know platonically, or maybe a very, very close friend who they've grown up with, or maybe someone they haven't known that long, who they've met, you know, not too long ago, but they feel they would be a good parenting partner. But there are misconceptions sometimes, and people shouldn't jump to conclusions on this, because number one, even if you enter into a platonic parenting arrangement with somebody who you trust, with somebody who you know, that could have problems down the line. That could go south just as much as a divorce can have problems. When people get married, they're swearing eternal commitment, pledging eternal commitment to someone, for better or worse, right? And then, you know, they're in divorce court. The same thing can happen in a platonic relationship. And while it doesn't end in divorce, there are other issues that could theoretically lead those parties to court, such as, for example, they're agreeing to have a child together, and, you know, everything sounds all well, but let's say there are differences in parenting views down the line. Let's say there is a change in views by one side or the other. Let's say other people get involved, and we'll talk about that. You know, new partners who have different views on and influences over the parents. Disputes over money, disputes over relocation. There could be a whole host of issues that, while you're not dissolving a marriage, you're not really insulating yourself from the potential for litigation or the potential for disputes, parenting disputes, simply because you had a platonic parenting agreement. So nothing is really problem-free, nothing's a guarantee, and people's views and relationships change, and people who start off as great friends may not be such great friends down the line. And another huge misconception, and we'll talk about this a little later in the program, is the concept that you can basically have a do-it-yourself program for platonic parenting. Basically, sometimes people feel, well, we have an agreement that we're going to have a child together, but for example, the sperm donor he's not going to be involved in the child's life. He's not going to pay child support. In this hypothetical, there's no parenting rights, but we've just arranged platonically that this person's going to kind of sort of be there. And unless you follow the strict statutory rules, for example, in New Jersey, for, you know, under the artificial insemination statute, you know, those agreements, these informal agreements that people reach, are not necessarily binding. So no matter what the parties have agreed upon between themselves about rights and obligations, the law may say something very different. And so, you know, and this has gotten some people in some hot water, that their expectation of what their arrangement was on their platonic relationship ended up legally being much different in terms of custody and parenting rights, in terms of support obligations, things of that nature. So if anyone is considering entering into a platonic parenting arrangement, it is logical for that person to consult with an attorney and to really know what they are doing beforehand, before just committing to have a child with someone, which is for life. So, if somebody understands what they're getting into and all of the risks and potential benefits of whatever arrangement they're seeking, then they have the right to make whatever decision they choose to, if it's an informed and voluntary decision. But sometimes people jump to conclusions over this stuff, and it ends up backfiring to some degree.
You. All right. Is there any New Jersey law on this issue, Larry?
The answer to that is kind of yes and no. There are two kinds of law generally, really in any state. You have statutory law, which is the law created by the legislature, statutes and bills and things like that, and then you have case law, which is created by judges essentially, who write opinions in response to specific fact patterns and cases and disputes that come before them. So you go to a law library, you're going to see statutes and you're going to see cases. So using the term Platonic parenting, to my knowledge, there is no specific statute in New Jersey, and we're dealing specifically with New Jersey right now, or cases that specifically really focus on the terminology Platonic parenting. However, there are statutes and cases that are, at least in my view, very relevant on this issue. Because while they may not use the term Platonic parenting, the issues they address are material to Platonic parenting relationships, or someone who is considering the possibility of entering into a Platonic parenting relationship. So for example, just some basics. This isn't, a law school seminar, but just some basics. Generally, your right to choose, how to procreate and who to procreate with is a matter of privacy. That's been determined by the United States Supreme Court. There are cases of Griswold versus Connecticut from 1965, Eisenstadt versus Baird in 1972, and Carey versus Population Services in 1977. Also, the United States Supreme Court has indicated you have a right to have a relationship with your child generally. That's a case called Stanley versus Illinois in 1972. Now, moving up to the present time in the 2020s here in New Jersey, what do you have? Well, I mentioned it briefly before. New Jersey has an artificial insemination statute. It's NJS 9:17-44 is the particular section I want to talk about. And it sets forth the specific protocol for persons who want to be artificially inseminated and not have the donor have ongoing parental rights or obligations. That's sometimes the agreement people have. Let's say in a hypothetical case, a woman wants to have a child. She has a male friend. The male friend is going to be the donor, and the parties, quote, agree that the donor is not going to have really any role in the child's life. So if the legal intent is for there to be no legal rights or obligations by the donor, you have to follow strictly what the legislature said is the statutory steps for that to occur. So in the statute, it says specifically, unless there's a written agreement to the contrary, the donor of semen provided to a licensed physician, physician's assistant, or advanced practice nurse for use in artificial insemination of a woman other than the donor spouse or partner in a civil union is treated in law as if the donor was not the legal parent and shall have no rights or duties. So what that essentially means is if the donor, under the supervision of a physician or physician's assistant or an advanced practice nurse, donates the sperm and then you have artificial insemination, by doing that, the donor does not become the parent. And so the recipient, when mom gives birth in this hypothetical, basically this is not a Platonic parenting relationship because the father has no rights in this situation. He gave them up. On the other hand, if you don't follow that, if it's not done, for example, under the supervision of a physician, and sometimes you have specific cases, case law, which deals with the situation where two people just agreed, they were going to have a child together, even with artificial insemination, but not supervised by a physician. The rights and obligations of the donor parent may continue to exist, regardless of what the intent was of the parties when they entered into that agreement. So there is an exact case on point in New Jersey called EE versus OMGR, where that is exactly what happened in 2011. And the parties arranged that there was going to be a sperm donor, but it wasn't going to go through a physician. And the donor was not going to have any rights or obligations. And the baby was born. They presented a consent order to the court to formalize the arrangement, and the court refused to sign it, saying you did not follow the specific protocol that the legislature laid out. Why? Because if it's not supervised by a physician, there could be fraud, and there could be all kinds of things which take place. So E versus OMGR, a very important case. And then another case, which deals with what's called tri-parenting, came out of Ocean County Court, the court where I sat, by another judge back in 2014, called DG versus KS. And in that case, you had what was essentially a platonic parenting relationship, even though they didn't specifically use that term in the case. They called it tri-parenting. You had a same-sex couple, two males, and they had a female platonic friend. And they agreed they were going to have a child together and raise the child, the three of them, as parents. And they had an informal agreement. It wasn't reduced to writing or anything like that, I don't believe. But even if it was, that wasn't really the main issue, because ultimately what happened is the great relationship that these three individuals had. And by the way, they went on various television shows and things like that promoting this relationship. There's a new kind of parenting, but it fell apart because the female got involved with another male individual, and she was going to move to California. And all of a sudden, there were all these new issues emerging, and how was the co-parenting going to work? So it ended up in court, and notwithstanding the fact that it was really, in essence, a platonic parenting arrangement, they were in all kinds of litigation, and the court had to make all kinds of decisions relative to who had the rights to the child, and whether there was going to be ongoing joint tri-parenting, and whether mom could move or could not move with the child to another state. But it became a legal mess. So the lesson in that is that you could have the greatest intentions in the world for platonic parenting, but circumstances in life can change, and you can still be right back in kind of the same type of situation that many married people are in when they're having disputes over custody or parenting time upon divorce. And there are other cases which talk about the issue of psychological parenting, stuff like that, but I know we're kind of short on time, so I won't get into that right now.
All right. What circumstances can change a platonic parenting agreement? Joni, your thoughts on this?
Well, there's always unforeseen circumstances that were not originally considered on the original agreement. And one example that I might give is that if somebody didn't anticipate a child born with a disability, and now all of a sudden, the needs of the child changes and the needs of their support changes. So now how is that going to look? And, one person might be able to handle, the demands of a disability, and another person may not want to have anything to do with it because they feel just so overwhelmed with it. So that's just one example of something that, can change that wasn't considered in the original agreement. There can be a change in circumstance. For instance, somebody could have lost their job. We see that a lot with COVID today. So the financial obligations or the abilities may have changed. There may have been a relocation that had to take place because of employment. So where you had somebody that was living in close proximity to each other, now we're looking at distance in the parenting time. As Larry mentioned earlier, there could now be, the involvement of another romantic relationship. And if there's going to be a commitment in that romantic relationship, then that person may now have influence over what that original agreement was. So there can be a change of way of thinking. So, we always change with our experiences. So what I may have done or thought years earlier through my experience and my own evolution, I may not be thinking that way anymore. So just in that evolution in itself. But then again, there's changes within the child's growth. So they have their own needs and their own desires. And what are the flexibility in the parent's role to that? How are they responding to those new and different situations? And again, what are personal triggers? So there may be people that are triggered by a previous experience that are completely closed off to something based on that past trauma that they may have individually encountered. So frame of references come into play. So as you can see, there can be like so many different, variables to cause a change in a parenting agreement.
And in addition to that, sometimes it's simply an argument between the parties. Look, it's just like, again, analogizing it to divorce. People could have had a great marriage up until a certain point, and then they had a blowout argument over anything. There could be a million reasons why married people fight. Well, the same thing can happen with platonic parents. And there's a tendency, when you ask the question before, Andrew, sometimes what are some misconceptions, that when people enter into these agreements, platonic agreements, that, well, everything is going to be, splendid for the next 18 years, because at that moment in time, they have a great relationship with another person. They think they do, without the complications of marriage or without the complications of any other type of involved relationship. But still, things can come up a million different ways, obviously. You don't have to be married to have a fight with somebody. And so when these things occur, it can clearly impact on the ongoing, success of a co-parenting relationship, especially some feel when there really isn't that much of an other history, any rooted history between the parties. When people are married or they've been together for a long time, even if they're not married, they sometimes draw upon that to resolve issues because they know each other very well and they have gone through the ups and downs of life together. If it's somebody who you don't know very well or only known in a limited capacity, even if it's a best friend, your best friend, is in their role as a best friend. You're not kind of going through the, life together. You're not sharing a home or raising children together, and I know Joni's going to talk a little about that. But, these challenges are in and of themselves circumstances that can change the platonic agreement. People don't necessarily agree or want to agree with the other side anymore just because they did a year ago. Joni?
All right. Binding is a written agreement before conception. Larry?
Yeah, this is, again, coming back to potential misconceptions that people have. Some, and I've heard this, from different people who've talked about platonic parenting. Well, what if we put everything in writing beforehand? Okay. Well, you can certainly do that. The everything can be unlimited when you think about it. I mean, when you try to, plan out what your child's life is going to be for the next 18 years, that's going to be a pretty long document. And you'd have to be Nostradamus to try to predict every possible thing that's going to happen. But some people try to do that. They micromanage and have 19 different clauses for every possible contingency they could think of. Even if they do that, agreements concerning a child, even a child who hasn't been conceived yet, while they are relevant and they reflect what the intent of the parties was at a particular point in time, they're not necessarily binding or enforceable by a court, even though a court could enforce it, doesn't have to enforce it. And if they do enforce it, they can modify it. And even if they enforce it on day one, they could not enforce it a year later if there are changes in circumstances. Why? Because ultimately the role of the court, you see, is to protect the best interests of the child. The best interest of the child takes priority over whatever the contractual agreement may be between two parents. So by way of example, if two people agree, say they have a child together and they agree that one parent is not going to pay child support to the other parent. Well, two parents can agree on that, but the parent who says I'm not accepting child support can also change their mind the next day. That agreement is as good only so long as the parties honor that agreement. If one decides that, listen, I need child support, they can go to court. And it doesn't really matter if that agreement was signed and notarized by 30 different witnesses. A court can still throw it out because the beneficiary of the child support is not the other parent, it's the child. The child was not a party to that agreement and could not have been, especially if they weren't born yet, but even if they were born, they're a minor, right? So you can't contract away the rights of a child, even if you're the parents, even if you're the Platonic parents. So when you look at that in the context of a Platonic parenting arrangement, you could have any agreement you want, and as long as the parties follow it, it sets a framework for how people are going to live. It can be used as evidence in court. But if a court says, listen, this is contrary to the best interest of the child, we need to change this or that on any aspect of it, not just child support, but parenting time and stuff like that, the court can do that because the best interest of the child cannot be compromised away or contracted away by parents. And the court has an obligation to protect the best interest of the child. So how binding is a written agreement before conception? It's really not binding with absolute certainty upon any court generally. However, if in fact, if there's a dispute as to what the parties intended, it could be relevant in an analysis. In terms of an agreement, though, for artificial insemination, that type of agreement, which is different from a Platonic parenting agreement, if the agreement is that the donor is not going to have any rights, as long as you follow the statute that I mentioned before, it should generally be enforceable.
Thank you. How might parenting issues be addressed in a Platonic parenting agreement? Joni?
Well, first of all, there's a verbal agreement, like Larry had referred to, that is now put into writing. And those specifics are going to vary from individual to individual. So some of the things that you might see in the agreement is whether the child's going to be breastfed or bottle fed. What are the financial responsibilities of each partner? Who's going to be the primary caretaker? What are the living arrangements are going to be? Where are the locations? What are the parenting time? And then we get into the future plans. What's the nutrition? Are they going to be vegan, vegetarian? Are they going to have a regular diet? What's the religion going to be? How about what daycare or what schools they're going to go to? Even down to sometimes in those agreements, we see physicians. We've also seen who may be shielded from involvement in that child. So somebody might have a family member that they'll say, I don't want them to go anywhere near my child, and they'll put that into the agreement. But I think what's important to note is that these agreements are anticipated and they're based on a vision, because like Larry referred to, the baby isn't even born yet. And it's based on the current relationship of the partners. How many times have we seen or heard somebody say, once the ring got on the finger, when we got married, things changed. Well, what's a marriage? Marriage is a commitment. What is this? This is a commitment. Or after we had a child, everything changed. So you can have a vision, but until something actually occurs, many times we really don't know how we're going to feel or how we're going to react until that happens. And again, like Larry said, these agreements are really based on the best interest or the well-being of the child. However, when these agreements are formed before a child is even born, aren't they really based on the parents' desires and what the visions are? So the child is going to grow up and they're going to start to have their own uniqueness. They're going to have their own wants and their desires. And, you know, and what is the flexibility now to that agreement in not what the parents want, but what the child wants? And like I said, it's really hard to anticipate, you know, everything. Like I gave an example earlier, if you never anticipated that a child, you know, was going to have a disability and they did, you know, how are you going to react? Many people don't know how they're going to respond until they're in that situation.
Let me just give you a simple example here. Let's assume two people agree they're going to have their friends, their longtime friends, are going to be Platonic parents. And during the time they reach the agreement, let's say it's a man and woman, and they agree that, you know, dad will be in the picture a little bit. What does a little bit mean? And they even take the time to write it all out there. He's gonna, you know, he can visit during the summer and Christmas and Easter, something like that, some whatever holidays. But otherwise, that's pretty much it. So the concept is that, mom is going to be primarily the caretaker of the child, and dad is just kind of sort of going to be there. And they reach that agreement. And then, a year or two goes by, and dad says, you know what? I want to be part of this child's life. I changed my mind. I thought at the time I wanted to just be kind of, peripheral, but now I want to be more involved. It could be a lot of different reasons. Sometimes, very, very genuine, and sometimes some, could be suspicious. Who knows? Each case is different. However, does he have the right to seek more time with the child, notwithstanding the agreement that everyone entered into before the baby was even conceived, much less born? The answer is yes. The answer is yes, because the theory is that a court would then have the right to consider whether additional parenting time is in the best interest of the child, number one. And also, as I indicated earlier when I was giving you some case citations, the United States Supreme Court has addressed in Stanley versus Illinois that generally a parent has a constitutional right to a relationship with the child. Now, that doesn't mean every parent can see their child whenever they want. Some parents, there are safety issues, there's child abuse involved, or, criminal behavior, that type of thing. But in general, that's a right that's protected that can't necessarily be contracted away in a way that's going to bind a court, or in this instance, the state of New Jersey, from relooking at it, regardless of what was written in the agreement, and potentially restructuring it so it's in the child's best interest. Now, if the child doesn't know the parent, it's perhaps arguably unlikely there's suddenly going to be all this visitation, one day later, parenting time, as they call it. But there could be, for example, gradual transitions, increasing time more and more as time goes on, seeing how it goes. And to the extent that the other parent says, well, this is not what I signed up for, this is not what we agreed to in our Platonic parenting agreement, that parent may be out of luck in a lot of cases, because they misunderstood how the law works in terms of rights and obligations concerning a child, in this instance, in a Platonic parenting arrangement, or in any other type of relationship. The fact that it's a Platonic parenting relationship doesn't give it some new set of laws under which the court would govern it. The child is the child, whether or not the parents had a Platonic relationship, a romantic relationship, a good or bad marriage, or any other relationship. It's a child-centered approach in these types of cases. Each case is fact sensitive, so there could be facts in each case that either favor or disfavor increased parenting time, or changing in certain terms in an agreement. Sometimes the terms are working very well, and to change them may destabilize the child. But if a court declines to change the agreement, it wouldn't be because they can't change the agreement. It would rather be based upon the facts and the determination, in all likelihood, that they shouldn't change it because it would not be in the child's best interest to do so. I hope that answers it, Andrew.
So Larry, how might financial issues be addressed in a Platonic parenting agreement?
Okay, this is something that sometimes people don't want to talk about when they're having they have a Platonic arrangement. They have this vision that there's going to be, this great parenting relationship for the next 18 years. And, you don't want to bring up, the M word, money. But that's really important, because that's what half of the family courts are fights over that. I mean, they are, maybe more. And, so it makes sense if you're going to consider going into a Platonic parenting relationship and making that type of long-term commitment, to have a legitimate discussion about finances. So sometimes I'll give you another hypothetical. People say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a child together, right? And we're going to split all costs for the child equally. They'll put a clause like this in their agreement. That sounds fair, right? Well, there could be a lot of problems with an agreement like that down the line. While in theory it could work if the parents get along and they can figure out which expenses to divide, and they've got it all worked out, it could work. A couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, the child is entitled to be supported by both parents in accordance with that parent's ability to pay. That's a child's right. So if you have one parent in the Platonic agreement who's making $25,000 a year, and the other parent is making $250,000 a year, you say you're going to split the cost 50-50. What does that mean relative to the child? What it means is that child will be living a lifestyle of the $25,000 parent, not the $250,000 parent, because the one who's earning $25,000 can't afford to pay anymore. Right? They can't. So how is that parent, the one making $25,000, going to split the costs 50-50? They won't have the money to do it. Logically, mathematically, what it more likely means is that the parent who's making $250,000 will pay as if he or she was earning $25,000. So that way they can each pay their 50%. That, how else would it work, right? Which means that the child is really not being supported in a manner consistent with the wealthier parent's ability to pay, even though it's a child's right. So what's supposed to happen, and what happens when you go to court on these issues, is there is a financial analysis. Each side submits information as to what they earn, what their resources are, their income, their assets. They have what's called a case information statement, which is basically a financial disclosure statement. They have in New Jersey and most states what they're called child support guidelines, which give at least some rebuttable presumption as to what the support should be, but there could be modifications of that. And the court has to look at that and determine what's a fair amount that each side should pay. Logically, if someone's making 10 times the income that the other side is, they should be contributing more because they can afford to pay more. So that's one issue, which means obviously when you take it, when you take it to the logistics of putting together a Platonic parenting agreement, that you couldn't even begin to address the issue of financial contribution or child support unless what? Unless there's disclosure by both sides to the other as to what their financial resources are. If you don't have that, how do you even begin to determine the fairness of an agreement unless you just, going by the seat of your pants and saying, all right, we're going to split everything 50-50. That's number one. And number two, even if they earn the same exact money, how in practice does that actually work when you split the costs 50-50? Who's paying for what? Does each side buy a separate, set of clothes for the child? Does either side have veto power or the right to object to the discretionary expenses of the other? Does the other have the right to buy anything they want and then just send the bill to the other side? How do you handle disputes over bills? Or what one side said, you don't need to shop at Macy's. You could shop at Sears or wherever, any store that exists now, or on Amazon. Some people have, higher tastes than others sometimes economically, or demands. And then there's a dispute over that. You see that in court all the time. Why do you have to eat steak every night instead of, hamburger or spaghetti, that type of thing. And so you get into those issues. And so there's lots of issues in terms of basic child support that some people enter into agreements and they haven't even thought about that. We'll deal with that. That's uncomfortable talking about money, so we'll talk about it down the line. And down the line suddenly comes up the first set of bills you have for the child. And other issues, you have, what about daycare? If both parents work, who's paying for that? Who's providing the daycare, right? So you have issues concerning that. You have health insurance. You have uncovered health-related expenses. Medical, dental. You're not going to have dental for the first few years, probably a child's life, maybe sooner. Pediatric dentistry, pharmaceuticals, special expenses. Like Joni has mentioned, if the child has special needs, a child with developmental disabilities, there's usually a cost with that. Logically, you would need life insurance to be considered, because what if either parent dies? You have a young child, the other parent suddenly has all the responsibility for the child financially without any child support because one parent's deceased. So having life insurance becomes logical in those types of situations. Extracurricular expenses. There's lots of litigation over this. Who's paying for the dance lessons or the cheerleading lessons or the gymnastic lessons, and is there a cap on that, or is it just unlimited? So there are all kinds of issues. And again, people, just like when they get divorced, or separated, people can try to address these issues. But in a divorce situation, it's usually after some big fight, and they could have lawyers on both sides, and there's mediators and everyone else, and they're trying to put the puzzle back together again. With a Platonic parenting arrangement, assumedly you're not at war with each other, or you wouldn't be having this discussion about having a child together. But you have to have enough foresight to plan in advance and at least think about these issues and discuss them in detail, so that if you're going to put an agreement together, it at least has some basis and some relevance. And then whether it's going to be changed or not in the future, that's another story. But at least you have a starting point. And if there is a lack of understanding or consistency between both parties as to what the financial arrangements are, if it's not discussed or each one just has a different understanding, it's a recipe for litigation when the child's very young. Joni? Yeah. Okay.
There's some risks involved with online Platonic parenting services. So I think, Joni, you can speak to this.
Yeah, well, Andrew, I could tell you that I have friends that have met online and they have beautiful, flourishing, healthy relationships. But then we also hear of people that have gone online. And when we think about, the online parenting services, aren't we really looking at a matchmaking for parenting? So there's some of the same things that we have to go in with our eyes wide open and not our eyes wide shut. So what I'm talking about is, what is the regulation? Are there background checks on the people that are going to festivals for meetings, or who are vying for these relationships? Are the things that they're disclosing, have they been validated? Because, in many chances, maybe they are not. And I always say it's very important that people be very, very careful to persuasion, especially when they don't, know the individual. Manipulations can be high. And I can say that there's things that are put in place where they say, let's, be involved with X amount of meetings and X amount of times, and let's go through counseling. And usually, let there be at least a year. But Andrew, I'm a mental health professional. And as a mental health professional, maybe my frame of reference is a little bit different, because I know that there's individuals that have sociopathic tendencies or narcissistic behaviors. And if they have different intentions when they're seeking out such a parenting agreement or a relationship with somebody, if they had to carry on for 2 years to reach their goals or their desires, that will happen. There's no time frame on it. So I think when we're talking about the risk of the services that are available, yeah, there's probably some very good services out there, and some of them are just jumping on board. I just think that it's very important that the individuals that are seeking are just very well informed, and they're looking at all angles and just not get impulsive or emotional to what they think is happening and not what is actually happening. That's all.
You don't impulse shop for a parent. You got to let it play out, and you got to really, and you never, you could know someone for 20 years and still not know them theoretically, but at least you have a better chance, if you give yourself some reasonable period of time, to get to really know somebody, and not just know them how they are online or on Zoom, but in stressful situations, right? Because when you become a parent, you're going to have some degree of natural stress. There's obligations, responsibilities involved. So you meet somebody you don't really know, and they have not been a parent before, let's say, and even if they genuinely, are want to be a parent, they could end up not being a good match for a lot of different reasons. They may not be ready for the job description, so to speak. And so, that there's a risk with anybody, obviously, but particularly in the online forum, and when people meet people and get together so fast without really having any roots with that person to making these big commitments, there's an inherent risk, obviously.
Well, I think the key, I think the key, what you say is commitment, because whether somebody terms it as a marriage, it's still a commitment. And if you look at the rate of divorce, and you look at the rate of what the relationships were and what they emerged into, how they fell apart, And, was it based on the demands and the stresses and the flexibility and the compatibility to compromise? All those things. Those basic foundation things don't change because it's not considered a traditional marriage. There's still, commitment and obligations. And, people will say, this is not the person I married, or they changed, because we're constantly going through evolution and we don't know how we're going to respond to the demands when there's one stressor on top of another. People do have their, breaking points, and certain things, emerges as time and demands go on.
All right. Well, come to our last question today, but again, I encourage any of the audience members, if you have questions, please send them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'd be happy to answer them. What is co-parenting counseling, and how can that help in a Platonic parenting agreement? So, Joni, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, a lot of times we see, co-parenting counseling when a marriage falls apart or is at risk of falling apart, and there's a counselor that gets involved, and they're dealing with known parental issues. There's known children, and that's what they're addressing. In this particular situation, though, the child's not born yet. And I think that it's very important when we get into scenarios or role playing. And what I always go back to in my mind is when I watched Let's Make a Deal. They would have two people that knew each other for X amount of years. They wouldn't face each other, and they would hold up a hand, and they would be asked a question, and one might say yes and the other one might say no, and they thought they knew each other very well.
Yeah, the newlywed game.
Yeah, it's like, to me, these things become very important, because if you really go, counselors vary. So if you really go to a counselor that, is looking at these particular hypothetical situations that can at any time become realistic. Life is not predictable. So let's say, like, even you have, two parents, and let's say one gets in an accident, and their life completely changes over that accident. How is the other one going to react to that? Are they going to step up to the plate? Are they going to run away? Things of that nature. So it really is an opportunity of exploration to see how somebody's going to react, or even how are they going to discipline. So people have different frame of references to not only disciplining, but how important, what kind of priority that is. So if I have a very high priority, let's say to religion, or I have a very high priority to the disciplining, and my potential partner doesn't, have that as a priority, and but there may be like a disrespect, to that. That's something that would be beneficial to know in advance, because if it means enough to that person, they might like double check this and say, you know what, maybe I need to explore this a little bit further. And if you have the right counselor, there's things that are going to come out. How do you handle stress? How do you handle disappointment? How do you handle the intrusion, of family members, or what the demands even in somebody's employment might become. So to me, the co-parenting counsel just increases the focus in helping in the decision-making process of your potential partner.
It's really a forum for additional exploration, or really investigation, before committing to a Platonic parenting agreement. If there's somebody, whether you've known them a long time or maybe not so long a time, but you're considering possibly entering into this type of arrangement, really, if you haven't raised a child together, you don't have a whole lot to fall back on to really determine, is this person going to be a good fit or not, other than what they are saying. And what people say might be a little different than how things play out, as we all know, intentional or otherwise. So in the co-parenting forum, co-parenting, like Joni said, this is something which You see it a lot in separations and divorces. Sometimes it's actually ordered by a court. Sometimes it's just voluntarily agreed to by the parties to go. It's kind of like the opposite of marriage counseling. Marriage counseling, you're trying to save a marriage or save a relationship. Co-parenting counseling assumes the parties are separate. They don't have a relationship, at least a romantic relationship, but they still have obligations to each other and to the child as a co-parent to efficiently and effectively work with each other, even in the absence of a romantic relationship, as you see with many divorced parents. And so in the context of co-parenting counseling, if parties went to a counselor, in the course of getting to not only know each other, but to explore whether they would potentially be a good fit as parents, and nothing's a guarantee, but at least provide some information that you could look at. The counselor could work with the parties over a series of sessions, could go on for several months in terms of what each one's concept is on what this life is going to be like as co-parents. It may be that what they tell the co-parent, what one tells the co-parent, is completely different than what the other one does. And then there's a problem, because their expectations right off the bat, whether they were verbalized to each other or not, or miscommunicated, are inconsistent. You start off with an inconsistent idea of how this is going to work, you're naturally increasing the chances it's going to fall apart to everyone's detriment, including the child's. So the co-parenting counseling usually, and you can put this in writing, but it's generally the case. It's usually better, I guess, in writing, that it's confidential, that it's not going to be used outside of the counseling sessions. So that encourages people to talk openly, that type of thing. That the counselor is not going to be called for or against either party in a court proceeding, for the most part. And to see if at the end of several sessions, many sessions perhaps, if the parties feel comfortable enough at that point that they know each other, not just online or in, going out to the restaurant together, but in a serious forum like a co-parenting counselor's office, that there's enough of a consistency and commonality in approach that you maybe want to continue to consider the possibility of having a child together if that's what they really want to do. Some may say, you know what, I really like this other person, but I just, after all the thought I've gone through in the co-parenting, I really don't want to do this at this point. I don't want to have a co-parenting relationship because it's really not what I thought it was when it was first brought up. And sometimes when you think about it, you have the input from a third person, such as a counselor, that type of thing, your views may change. So no one's here to tell anybody that they're right or wrong in considering a co-parenting relationship, but you have to do your homework and you have to take the time and energy to really, really think about these types of decisions and not be impulsive with them. It's also true with any other relationship, quite frankly.
Well, I think also the prioritizing is very important, because if you have two people with two different religions and they're both very strong about the religions and they can't come to an agreement on that, and it's both a very important priority, then that's going to start off problems right off the bat, and that's things that should be identified.
That's right. There could be issues such as religion. There can some instances be different customs that each one may adhere to, lifestyle issues, that you don't know about, things in someone's background. What happens when new people come into, your platonic relationship? You're likely each side's going to have other people in their lives come in, and then what happens then? How's that going to be handled? Is one side going to now object? I don't want this other person, being around my child. Why is my child calling the other one mom or dad? The same types of situations you see with step parents sometimes. These issues end up in court quite a bit. So going through the co-parenting counseling process is at least one tool that can help the parties, really focus to some degree, perhaps a little more sharply, on whether this is going to work or not. Even that's not a guarantee, but at least it's a tool that can potentially be used by some people with some efficacy.
And Andrew, I think it's important to note too that sometimes as relationships grow, there is a conversion of that sexual attraction. And there may be one person who started out platonic and now they have this desire to become romantically involved. And you may have one person, that says, no, that wasn't part of our agreement. We were agreeing on this. And then there can be a whole nother rejection that's there. when there can be other people that can say, hey, we started out, as friends, and we built this on a solid, foundation. And you know what? We had that agreement, but now we've emerged into this, and let's take this now to, another level. And that's the growth and the evolution. But, those things have to be taken into consideration too, because those are real life, occurrences that has happened in these situations.
No, that can absolutely happen. And if it's a platonic arrangement, and then one side decides he or she doesn't want it to be just platonic, they want it to go further, and the other side doesn't, that could set a whole negative dynamic of not only rejection, but anger and revenge and all this other stuff that you see play out in the court sometimes. Sometimes there are allegations that then one parent or the other is using the child in the middle of that situation for control. So these are all things that really, it's wonderful to have, positive thoughts when you're entering into a new relationship, but everyone owes it to themselves to think these things through. And there have been many, many anecdotal reports of very successful co-parenting relationships, of people who've had co-parenting relationships. Some meet online, some just meet, they've met through the journeys of life. And it works out very well. And that's, and so it can work. But what you don't hear about as often are those where it hasn't worked out. Those don't seem to make the newspapers very often for whatever reason. And so, but they're out there. The courts know they're out there, because you see these things come in whatever your relationship started out with the other parent. It ends up deteriorating, then it ends up in court. And so, there's always that possibility in every case. And this is why it's so important when anyone's considering entering into one of these agreements, go to an attorney, go to a lawyer, just talk it all through first and understand the pros and cons of what you're getting into. Also, potentially go to a counselor as well. And, give yourself the time to think about what you really want to do, because it's hard to turn back the clock once you've made a bad decision along these types of lines. And then if you still decide you want to do it, then you have a right under our law to make any decision you want, if it's your own voluntary, knowing decision. How much time we have left, Andrew? Where are we?
We're right up at 1 o'clock right now. I don't see any questions that have come through the Q&A or the chat. So we can wait a moment, but I just wanted to, in the meantime, extend my thanks to you, Larry and Joni, for presenting today. This is being recorded, so everybody who registered will get a link to the recording. I will also be providing a follow-up email that will include a recap, as well as the links that Larry has sent me for some more information about some articles and things to read up on this in case you want some more information. So I don't see anything coming through, so I guess we can call it there. So Larry and Joni, thank you so much. I'd also like to thank our attendees. You are what make our programming worthwhile, so we appreciate your time.
And thank you, Andrew, for having us.
Yes, Andrew, always a pleasure to present with the New Jersey State Library.
I'd just like to end on everybody be safe, be well, and hopefully we can see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.